Okay, hello everyone. This is a Mishcon Academy session, which is part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts. We have such a diverse range of guests. I think it's very much for me a privilege to participate in them, both as an audience member and sometimes, when I'm really lucky, as an interviewer. And I'm really delighted to introduce Thangam Debbonaire, who is going to talk to us about so many different topics. But it's a tremendous privilege to have a senior member of what is highly likely to be the government in waiting. And thank you so much for joining us. And I would like the audience to get to know you even better than perhaps they already do. So can we go on a whistle-stop tour
Yes,
of
we can.
your life?
Oh, well, I'm 57, so it'll take a while. I think the thing that has been talked about since I took up the culture, media and sport role at about 10:30 on the 4th of September, after a gruelling media round, which had started at sort of about 5:30 in the morning, is that I was originally a cellist. And I started playing the cello when I was 4, so it's usually a good place to start because that's basically most of my life.
You had a little one.
I had a little one, yes. I had a little 8-size cello and a little chair that my dad had specially sawn the bottom of the legs off so it was the right size. And rather poignantly, and this is a bit the life of a politician, no tiny violins for it, but my very first cello teacher, it was his funeral this morning.
Gosh.
Up in Yorkshire, and this is one of the deals you make as a politician is that like you won't be able to get to everything anymore.
Yeah.
But it was a lovely moment for me this morning, thinking about how playing the cello has given me such great joy. And these guys who work for me will know, my cello's in my office. And I do most weekdays try to get to the office very, very early so I can get in at least 20 minutes, just so that I've played most days.
When you were playing it most, how many hours a day did you play?
Well, probably when I was at music school. I was at Cheetham School of Music way back in the 80s. And, at that point, you get up very early, you practice, you go to choir practice, you do some academic lessons. And I was good at maths. I actually studied maths at university. So I did but it was a cunning subject because there's no essays with maths.
No.
And you play your string
There
quartet.
are numbers, though.
There are numbers, yes.
So
I'm fond of
not a
them.
complete free
Different
class.
sort of thing. But yes, I had choir before school, orchestra practice at lunchtime, string quartet practice. String quartet is my favourite medium, and I still, if we're going to sort of segue from 4 to school to now, I have a string quartet, parliamentary string quartet called, if you know your parliamentary jargon, this is a really corny name, but we're called the statutory instruments. Yeah, thank you for the laugh. It might have been a sympathy laugh. During the Brexit years, we we're allowed to say Brexit now, and still traumatising, mind.
Yes.
And the 4 of us got together. There's a woman called Emily Benn, who is from the Benn family, and Kathy Newman, who is a journalist, and a woman called Catherine Chiba, is a parliamentary researcher. And we formed... Emily, I think, met me at an event in the Speaker's House and said, we have to play together. And she's very, very strong-minded, so there was no choice. And we were rehearsing after Kathy did the news, but often before votes or just after votes during the Brexit years. And one day, Kathy didn't bring her music stand, and so we fashioned one out of box files that I had. I was a whip in those days. And DEFRA, I don't know if you remember any of you DEFRA policy. I mean, we were doing statutory instruments morning, noon and night, and quite often the same ones each week, because someone would find out on a Friday that there'd been a mistake made in one on a Tuesday, and we'd get back the next Tuesday and I'd go, hang on, we did this last week. So Kathy, because she's a journalist and a wordsmith, said we should be the statutory instruments. So we still play.
And are you a similar standard?
Yes, thankfully. It would have been really awkward, wouldn't it?
Yes.
If one of us had been terrible and the other 3 really good, how do you deal with that?
Yes. Well, how
3 of us terrible.
How would you? I mean, it's a cabinet question as well, isn't it? How would you have dealt with it?
I think we'd probably have played together once and then let it slide.
There would have been
But we hit it off. It was like a blind date. I mean, the 4 of us, we didn't all know each other. And when we got together, we realised very, very quickly, as any of you play musical instruments will know, sometimes it just works And it just did. It was one of it's one of the reasons why string quartets are my favourite medium. Is when it's right, it's one of the most beautiful forms of any sort of relationship you can have. And we're now really good friends as well. But
Yes.
the mechanics of playing a string quartet are really quite extraordinary. And
Yes.
in a way, a bit like being in a shadow cabinet or cabinet, that you all have your role. You need all of you.
Yes,
But
but
you
I
have
mean,
to work together.
and mostly cabinets don't work together.
Well,
So
I like to think ours definitely will. I mean,
yes, of
we're getting on
course.
splendidly.
Yes, of course, and that's a huge relief to hear. But still, it must be hard to move from the perfectly sequenced uh, performance in a group, a small group, even a quartet, to the kind of rough and tumble and enmities of political life, and that's just in your own party.
Well, we have moved beyond the
Yes,
challenging years, shall I call them?
yes,
A bit like a fever dream now.
yes,
Um,
yes,
I mean, I think Keir's splendid, and I mean, he
yes,
took over. Goodness me, I mean, he took over in the first few weeks of the coronavirus lockdown.
yes,
I mean, our first 6 months, 12 months, I think, where all our meetings were online. That's not a great way to form
no.
as a group. But Keir managed to get us to coalesce. I think he's done an amazing job of turning
Do you
us around.
think of him like a conductor of an
Yes,
orchestra?
very much. And he's a good one. You know, he knows how to command an audience. I think if
Yes,
you watch PMQs, you can see it. I mean, that's a skill. It's not easy. And in an orchestral concert, I mean, nobody yells at you, you know, so, well, not
yes.
usually anyway. So, no, I think he's really, he can command a room. He's great. And
But
he's
can
a
he
good
command
leader.
an orchestra?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, we're
He
also,
commands the Labour Party.
he very much does, and I think in a
Yes,
really good way. I think
yes.
he's brought on the talents of many different people in the Parliamentary Labour Party and spotted potential. I would say that, wouldn't I? Because he gave me the job I wanted. But, you know, I think he's done that for many people. He's really brought us together.
This is the third shadow cabinet position.
Yes, too. Yes.
Yes,
I was surprised when Keir phoned me on the 4th of April 2020 to say, I want you to be my shadow housing secretary.
yes,
And I enjoyed it, but, you know, as I think Lisa Nandy said, she was the first Shadow Foreign Secretary not to leave the country. In fact, I don't think she left Wigan.
right.
And I was the first Shadow Housing Secretary not to see a single house. I mean, you know, doing
Yes,
that job in a lockdown was tricky.
yes,
And he then moved me on to Shadow Leader of the House, which is one
yes.
of those very niche roles. But if you love Parliament, and I do, it was an absolute joy. And I'd been a whip for 3 years, so you
Yes,
get to know the mechanics of Parliament and how it works,
yes.
how processes work, and so that was a lovely role.
And you were opposite Rees-Mogg.
I was opposite Rees-Mogg,
And
and then
how was
eventually,
that?
well, it was combative. There was then a man called Mark Spencer, and then Penny Mordaunt. Penny Mordaunt is still in post and had a fantastic starring role in the
Yes,
coronation
with the
with
sword.
the sword and the outfit.
Yes,
Cracking
sword and
outfit.
the outfit.
I mean, the
Yes,
outfit was quite something. I was half watching the coronation, and I had to leave the room for something. And I said to my partner, "Can you just keep watching for me? Call me if anything happens." And there was this screech from the other room when he said, "Come quick! Penny's holding a giant stick." And it was quite something. I mean, it's actually quite heavy. So yeah, she must have trained.
she did. She did well, and
Yeah, she
that
did.
gave her a huge profile in the
It did.
country.
But I also like to think it gave the role of Lord President of the Council a great role, because that's the role
Right.
she was doing it in.
Yes, I think that may be a
Very,
pious hope.
very obscure.
Yes, yes.
But it means you technically make the king. I mean, she had to do the ceremony in which the king is technically becomes king.
Going right back then to the beginning of your political life, your mother was a Labour Party person.
My dad was a musician who came over on the boat from what was then Madras via what was then Ceylon through the Suez Canal. He spent his 19th birthday on the Suez Canal to take up a scholarship at the Royal Academy of Music as a pianist, and he was second study organ, and he met my mum, who was also a pianist, second study organ
Right.
at the Academy, and she came from a very political family. her parents were both trade unionists, co-op party members and Labour Party members.
Right.
My granddad was shop steward at the Cowley Works. He
Right.
moved there from Manchester when it was an armaments factory during the war. And of course, then it was cars.
Yes.
And he became a Labour councillor. And it's a classic, in a way, it's a classic political sort of male-female thing, because my grandmother was highly intelligent, highly politically aware, would have made a superb politician. But in those days, the women made the tea. And my grandfather, it was very rare for women to be in politics. I mean, there have been women in the Parliamentary Labour Party since 1923.
Jenny Lee.
Jenny
was a
Lee, but that was
huge
just quite late on. I mean, there were
Yeah.
Ellen Wilkinson and
Yes,
Margaret
of course.
Bondfield in
Yes.
the 20s and a few more, but it was still very rare.
Yes.
And my grandfather was asked if he would consider being a parliamentary candidate, and he said, "I'm a working man. I can't afford to take the time off work."
Right.
You know, it's not straight. It wasn't a straightforward
No.
thing, and in my view, my grandmother would have made the better MP. Anyway, I hope if there is a cloud, she's watching, and I hope she's proud.
I'm sure she is. But did you have a sense of frustration from her? Did she feel that she was being impeded in what she wanted to do?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, she gave me various pieces of life advice that consisted of don't get married, don't get kids, have your own money, buy your own house. I mean, she was very, very fierce on
Very
this subject.
clear advice.
Very, very clear. And actually did encourage me to think about politics, but I did not follow her advice at the time. I joined the Labour Party
Yes.
very early on. I mean, that was just an accepted transition of
Yes.
life in my family.
Yes. So how old were you when you joined?
18.
And you were just about to go to college at that point?
I joined, I think, probably it would have been just after I'd left. I was 18 in August, so I must have just left school and then went to university to study. Well, I went to Oxford to study maths,
Yes.
which I did not complete, I'm afraid to say, because I got to the third year and hit a plateau. I don't know if anyone here studied maths, but it was a shame. because
No,
loved it,
I
but-
hit the plateau around GCSE.
That was an O level, actually, wasn't it? It wasn't
Yes,
a
it wasn't.
GCSE.
Actually, it was just an O level in my case. But yes, and it is true that with maths, you just know when you can't go further.
Yes, I got to a plateau. It was a definite plateau because I'd been really good at it, and then suddenly, bang. But also, this was in the 80s. In those days, there was still an awful lot of tutors at Oxford that thought women shouldn't be doing maths. I was at a women's college, so in the first year I was cushioned. In the second year, when I had to be tutored at a men's college, which I will not name, my male tutor taught my male tutee partner entirely and ignored me. Which nowadays I'd sue him. No, but in those days I thought,
Well,
okay,
we
then.
would be very happy to act.
I wish I could remember his name.
You see, that was a slightly ambulance chasey kind of
Little bit.
situation on my part. But, yes, that's extraordinary and dismaying. My experience of mathematicians at university was that they were all bonkers. So,
Well,
so
there's probably
the
a bit of that.
is there? I mean, I was not at Oxford, but at the college, at the university I was at, the mathematician was in an asylum for most of the year, and only allowed out for I think 2 or 3 months. But what was said was that as he became saner, so his maths deteriorated,
Yeah, no, I can imagine that.
and that was a thing. So the idea that those people would also be discriminating on grounds of sex, it's kind of hard to fathom. But that's
I mean, it might just have been him, and it might just have been me. Nowadays, I can't imagine why I didn't just assert myself.
yes, yes, of course.
I'm not known for being unassertive, so.
No, but still, did you feel that that was a defeat when you?
Kind of yes and no, because by then I was enjoying what so many of us enjoy at university, which is, I was doing lots of things. I was playing the cello a lot. I was finding my way. I found both string quartets and playing live music in theatre, which were the two things I did most as a professional musician, and I just loved it. And it didn't stop when I stopped doing my degree. People kind of didn't really take in that I was no longer a student, so I was still part of student life.
Of course.
I was working.
Yeah.
I went and got a job, but yeah, I was enjoying my artistic life, and it was wonderful.
But did you then go on and do studies in music, or you just launched yourself?
Well, I
in your
was
musical
taught by a rather wonderful teacher called Raphael Wolfish, who I'm still friends with.
Right.
And still, he's the classic cello teacher. Like, before he says hello, he'll say, "Are you still practicing?"
Right.
And his mother, Anita Lasker-Wallfish, who I've also met, you know, if you don't know the story of Anita, it is quite something.
Please tell the story.
So Anita was a teenager at the time when she was sent to a concentration camp, and she survived because she and her sister survived because they played musical instruments, and they were put in the orchestra to entertain the Nazis at
Gosh.
the camp, 2 camps she was in, and eventually I think nearly starved, but eventually at the end of the war came here,
Yes.
and married a musician and went on to have Raphael and so on. And I think of that story of the cello as she literally survived the war because she played the cello, and I feel a great sense of I mean, a privilege, but also a responsibility that I never give up the cello, because I think, what Anita must have gone through, and because she did that. And then Raphael got to be the cello teacher that he is.
Yes.
And I got to learn from one of the most
Yes.
wonderful cellists in the world. I'm very, very lucky.
So it's a very timely moment in the year to tell that story.
Yes, it is.
But what I'm, apart from its intrinsic merit and interest, what I'm also hearing from that is that music playing has always been bound up in other activities and contexts for you.
Yes, and I mean, if you are a professional musician, many professional musicians, the general model is you just play music.
Yes.
But from quite an early age, I realised, and I think it's probably why I did other things as well as music from my 20s, I realised that I didn't just want to practice 5 hours a day, go to orchestra rehearsal, play a concert in the evening and marry a second violinist or something.
Right. Yet you make it sound so appealing.
Well, it is also appealing. It's the fork that I didn't turn down. But
yes.
the life of a young musician now is very different. I mean, I went to visit the Guildhall School of Music, which was where Raphael taught when I was learning from him, and I had a place and chose to do maths at Oxford instead. And they now do, whole parts of their courses are about how do you integrate your political interest into your music making.
Really?
Yeah.
How
It's great.
interesting.
So there's young people there who are doing stuff about sort of integrating their interest in environmentalism and sustainability.
Right.
Which is it's actually, when you think about it, there's a lot of relevance.
Yes.
But at the time we were taught was like, you practice. Rule number 1, very good life lesson, turn up on time. Rule number 2 is be able to play really well, because if you can't turn up on time, there's literally no point. And I found that, that was really good training as a musician. Which
be there.
You have to be there for the half. And if you're not, there's kind of no point to you. And there is no excuse. And my husband, who was an actor, was an opera singer, and has now gone back to music, tells a story that I can't remember the full details of, but it involves him literally running through London when the tubes stopped, because he knew he would get sacked and nobody would be interested. So that's a good discipline and an artistic discipline that I learned.
Yes, of course.
Which is invaluable for politics, because the same thing is true. Like, if you don't turn up, what's the point?
Yes.
If you're not in the chamber for your bit, and the parliamentary day can be quite chaotic looking from the outside.
Yes.
If you don't know how to read the codes of, well, I need to start moving now because my bit's coming in 10 minutes or 20 minutes.
Yes.
Then you miss your bit.
Yes.
I once, as a whip, had to, I won't tell you who it was, but I once had to make up a series of spurious points of order because a colleague hadn't arrived on time.
You had to busk.
I busked. I think the speaker knew exactly what I was doing, but luckily he was game. That was in the previous days.
Yes, but when you said about these young students who are being taught other stuff as well as music, my thought was actually how difficult it is to be a young student now, because you're expected to practice just as many hours, I guess, or whatever the equivalent, whatever you're studying. But then you have all these additional things which are piled on top.
Yes, but also I think what I saw when I visited the Guildhall, when I talk to young musicians now, is that the range of career options that you're encouraged to consider is much broader. Certainly at Chet's, I was taught, you aspire to be a soloist. You can't make it as a soloist. You need a string quartet and orchestral musician. If you're an orchestral musician, you want to be on the front desk.
Right.
And there was a sort of real sort of like, that's what you aspire to be. And I mean, nobody really thought of music therapy as a valid career for anyone except someone who couldn't make it in the other three, which is
And
terribly unfair. A music
has that
teacher.
attitude really changed
Yes,
now?
I think so. And I think also now young musicians are making music. One of my nieces is a musician, and her career is so interesting, and she does such a wide range of activities,
Right.
which includes, but is not confined to, orchestral depping. And I'm again, to bring it back to this role that I'm in, I think creative education is one of the things that certainly the creative organisations and the people that I talk to say is the most important thing for them. And I would say also encouraging young people to see creative education isn't just about whether or not you end up being a famous cellist. It's also, are you encouraged to be creative in your thinking? Are you encouraged to collaborate in the same way as
Yes.
you have to in a string quartet? Are you encouraged to problem solve, which as a musician you don't always realise, but that's what you're doing.
Right.
Is how do we technically, what's the thing that happens that allows us to make this noise together and then repeat it and make it sound
Right.
spontaneous? I mean,
Right.
that's actually relevant to lots of careers. And
Yes.
performance skills, which, you guys have to do.
We do.
You do. And,
do
and
all the
I
time.
personally think a musical training is just invaluable. Certainly, my colleagues' performance skills it's important.
It's true, because there is so much still, I think, the culture of admiration of the solitary creative genius, that it does tend to push everything else out. And the everything else is really important too.
Yes.
And are you, in your job and when you actually get into government, you'll be in charge of the everything else other than the solitary creative genius bit of creativity?
I love that you're allowed to say when. I'm going to say if.
Okay.
If we win the general election, and I hope to be Secretary of State for Culture, Media and
Yes.
Sport, it's a great gig. Let's
Yes.
be honest.
Wonderful.
Almost everything
All
that
those
anyone
free
enjoys,
theatre tickets.
which I don't have time to take up at the moment. Though I was at the Donmar to see Macbeth. Has anyone seen it? I mean, it's sold out now, but if you have any connections at all to get to go and see
That's
it.
with who is
Well, David Tennant and Cush Jumbo.
right.
But it's
Yes,
also, it's a
amazing.
clever thing because the sound comes through headsets. So although they're there, I mean, David Tennant's right there, and I know he's speaking, because at one point I took my headphones off just to check. But they get the sound through the headphones because they're doing some amazing things with sound. Absolutely amazing. It's quite phenomenal. There was one point where I started shrieking at the person next to me because it sounded as though the witches were sitting right next to me, which is just
Oh,
really
how
clever use
interesting.
of tech.
So it's like a kind of movie.
Yeah, but again,
quality.
to sort of wrench us back to
Yes,
my political
yes,
role,
yes,
I
please.
think, that, again, that sort of the creative thinking that goes into that, even if you did that at school as a happy amateur,
Yes.
that springboards you into so many interesting careers, and the technical careers that are involved in the creative industries they're incredible. I mean, I meet chippies and sparkies who choose to work in film because then you get to work with Indiana Jones or whatever, or
Yes.
James Bond. But you could just as easily be working on someone's loft. But people who are interested in the creative industries,
Of course.
getting to realise you don't just have to be an actor or a musician or a film
No.
director. You can be a technical person. And somebody technical made that show on Friday something absolutely magic that I will never forget. So it's an amazing role. But I mean, the interesting thing about the media, I mean, some of you will know professionally, the media landscape at the moment is going through enormous change.
So it's my responsibility to bring you to politics, because I know you don't want to talk about politics.
No.
And I'm here to partly find out more about you, but also to find out what you think and what the party thinks about some of the hot questions. And you'll just say if you can't answer. But I know everyone is very interested in license fee questions in the BBC. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about where the Labour Party is at the moment on that.
I'll give you a bit of process and some indication of direction of travel, because if you read the Times, you know that we're on a timetable at the moment with policy development. So it's a little mini purdah around lots of details. The licence fee will fall on, renegotiating the licence fee settlement will come on my watch if I'm Secretary of State, as will the charter renewal.
Yes.
Let's start with the basics. I love the BBC. I absolutely love it. I think if we didn't have it, we'd want to invent it. It's one of our best exports, both as a brand and as a commercial product. They are, the BBC, the biggest commissioner of the creative industries in the entire country. So why would I not want to protect them and give them every possible resource to do their jobs? They have suffered an egregious effective funding cut over the last 14 years.
Yes.
And that has impeded their ability, which I think they have got round creatively, but we
Yes.
know it's there, to do what they do best.
Well, just if you don't mind
So
me
that's
interrupting you.
Interrupt
Just
away.
no, I just want to look at the question of what it means to defend the BBC, because
I can talk about that.
defending the BBC implies that the BBC is under attack.
It definitely is.
And I would be really interested to hear what you think about the nature of the attack on the BBC and whether there's any element of legitimate critique in it, or whether one's simply saying, here is an institution which is fully and wrongly under attack, and it simply needs to be, I need to throw myself between the people firing the weapons and the institution itself.
I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about the BBC is this question of so-called bias.
Right.
I mean, first of all, I think the myth of objectivity is overblown. But second of all, if you look at the Ofcom guidance, it's about having impartiality in the round. So you can have a programme that takes a point of view, but you have to be able to show that you have presented other views as well.
Yes.
However, you don't have to take a balanced view of climate change. Climate change exists. You don't have to put someone else on that says, no, it doesn't. That would be ridiculous. I think now we know that.
Yes.
Whereas I think 15 years ago, there was still a tendency amongst news broadcasters to go, oh, we better have a climate skeptic. So objectivity is, there are specific questions on which you will view it in a particular lens. Now, I know because I've been up close and personal in the BBC. I talk to Tim Davie, the Director General, a lot. I talk to people who work in the BBC. I talk to viewers and listeners, obviously. But I also hear what I hear from the governing party. And to be fair, it's mostly from the backbenchers. But you will all know that the backbenchers include presenters of shows on another TV station that has news in its title. And that's quite challenging, I think. GB News has been found wanting by Ofcom many times. And I think it's been quite interesting to watch some backbench, in particular Tory MPs, attack the BBC on grounds of bias and then scuttle off and do their show.
Yes.
And that's not great as far as I'm concerned, but I think it's the BBC has an enormous amount of scrutiny. And if you take a thing, as a couple of government ministers did earlier this week, and say, well, I didn't like this sketch on the news quiz. I mean, honestly, if you listen to the news quiz, they really do they make fun of us too. And they're going to make fun of us even more if we're in government.
But do you think that the main attack on the BBC, which has implications for licence fee and charter renewal, is objectivity? Is that your sense?
It's one of
the
them,
issue?
but
because there are completely separate commercial considerations, aren't there, which run against the renewal of the licence fee.
There's a whole bundle of things, but I've mentioned the political attacks from a lot of Tory MPs. I don't think all at all. I think there are some who really love it. But I also know that I saw from the comments on my own Twitter feed the other day, I thought, well, I'm getting attacked from the left and the right for saying
you're
they're
doing
not biased.
something good.
So I must be doing something right, because there was one person who said, the BBC's biased against the Labour Party, watch Question Time and you'll see. And I thought, I've been on it. I do know that the audience in Question Time is tough.
Yes.
And Fiona Bruce, she's there to make good telly.
Yes.
So, yes, it's a tough gig, and I've definitely come away from Question Time feeling roughed up. But, if you take it as a whole production, is it biased against the Labour Party or the Tory Party? I've been on Question Time sometimes where I felt almost sorry for the Tory minister. There was definitely one show when I got really given, I think, quite an easy ride. I mean, I better not, if Fiona's listening, no, definitely not. But, it was an easy ride compared to the vaccines minister, because it was in the middle of the COVID crisis. We were 2 metres apart. The audience was 2 metres apart and everyone hated her. And, so I don't think that occasion that there was any bias against me. There was a lot of attack on her.
What's your sense of the appeal of the privatisation, the full privatisation of the BBC on the Conservative side?
I think there are
Is it
those who would love to.
But am I right in saying it's very much a minority position?
I haven't done a head count, but what worries me is when the Secretary of State, as she did a few weeks ago, stands at the dispatch box,
Yes.
talks about the licence fee and does not mention the words public service broadcasting. PSB is an important concept.
Yes.
We've got, ITV, Channel 4 and BBC. I was hosting a dinner looking at public service broadcasting earlier this week, and each of them's got a different funding model. It's been telling, I think, that having 13, I think it's the record number of cabinet ministers in 14 years, is the Culture, Media and Sport brief, and one of them, two secretaries of state ago, did not know how Channel 4 was funded.
Right.
That's a bad sign if you don't understand the PSB landscape.
So one thing's clear: the Labour Party stands for the principle of public service broadcasting.
Absolutely, and the principle of universality. And I've got to own up, because Anthony's been very polite. You may have noticed I haven't answered his question about what we're going to do to the licence fee. We've got challenges, because obviously we want people who are, the licence fee exemption for people over the age of 75. It's not great that that's fallen on the BBC. That means effectively the BBC is paying a social benefit.
Yes.
And it's been a cost to them. Now they've done it.
Yes.
Is that the right thing to have done?
Politically impossible for the Labour Party to row back on.
Difficult. I mean, in a difficult financial situation, which we're in, I definitely can't say that we're going to do that. But we will have as fundamental principles universality. I do not want 2 tiers of access.
So, sorry, just for the sake of the one person who doesn't know what that is, we're talking about a kind of premium service which people have to pay for in addition to the licence.
And that's a proposal which is around.
Yes.
And I don't see a world in which a Labour Party is going to bring that in. It goes against everything of who we are. We're about equality. We are the party of equality. It's the 100th anniversary this year, this week, of when the Labour Party was first in government, and we went in with ambitions for equality, and those have never left us. The nature of that, obviously, that's changed over 100 years. What that means, how we conceptualise it. But for me, the BBC is a good example of that. Is that from its start, it was available to all, and it was to serve the public.
So I'm Tim Davie for the purposes of...
I'll tell him that when I see him next.
I'm Tim Davie for the purposes of this question, and I come to you and I say, dear Minister, we've gone through the funding agony. We now know what the licence fee is. That means I'm only going to be able to make 80% of the programmes that I wanted to make. Would you please let me charge for the football matches that we broadcast, because it would not represent a problem for the football fans. It would be, a quid a match or something like that. And it would transform our program making capabilities. It's a simple thing. It's a reasonable request. What do you say?
Well, first off, Tim Davie definitely hasn't said that to me.
No, of course.
Or inferred. I just want to make sure we're all clear.
You're not in a position to say yes or no yet either. But I mean, purely as a hypothetical, how does that violate the universal access?
Well, it violates the listings regime as well. And
no, I understand.
Depending on which.
But just in political terms, why would that be absolutely out of the question? No.
Because we believe in the principle of universality and public service broadcasting, and we're not shifting that. I'd be interested in any proposal Tim can come to me with, and he is, with how the BBC might be able to maximise its income. But there are there's other routes, like maximising its ability on commercial sales, is something that I'm much more likely to consider how we would help that of their product. Than charging British people to watch something that's always been part of public service
or
at the point of delivery. I mean, obviously,
maybe at the moment of delivery, but then saying iPlayer can charge for people who didn't want to sit in front of the TV at the moment that it was first broadcast.
I mean, you bring up iPlayer, and I think that's part of the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that 800,000 people, well, there are 800,000 licence holders, I think it's roughly that, than there were a few years ago. And one of the reasons is probably you've got a whole generation of young people who don't own a telly
Yes.
and don't conceptualise watching or consuming TV products in the same way as those of us who were used to sitting down and there were 3 channels. You know, that's it's just a complete different mindset. And there's a challenge, I think. Questions we will have to answer are, if you consume BBC product on a phone on the way to work, what does the licence fee mean? But there has to be a way of funding the BBC so that it allows it to be the public service broadcaster that we treasure, and we'd miss if it was gone. And it's the most trusted source of news and current affairs. And that stuff isn't going to, you're not going to be able to go out to market and sell your news and current affairs.
No. So
and it's got to be good.
I'm only going to be Tim Davie for another 1 minute, so I can ask this follow-up question, and then we'll move on. But I'm really interested in the funding question because I think it just worries us all. If what happens is that the government, the present government, does not do the radical thing and privatise, but instead it settles on a funding provision which leaves the BBC a bit starved of cash.
It's done that already.
Even more so.
Yeah.
And that's what you inherit. And then the BBC comes to you, Davie comes to you and asks you the question, and you say, well, I'm not going to allow you to charge for any of your services. And he says, well, that's the only idea I've got. So unless you're going to give me lots more money, which don't suppose you will. And I imagine if I can think of this, then I've no doubt he thought of it a long time ago. So do you think he's privately praying for a Conservative victory because he thinks that the Conservatives would be more likely to let him introduce a 2-tier system?
Tim Davie's private prayers are definitely not in my
No, but do you
part
see
of my
what I
knowledge,
mean?
but-
Do you see?
No,
I mean, is it in the
I
end in the interest of the BBC
see
to
that.
charge for football, which is what they would get from a new Conservative government, but not from the Labour government?
I mean, you bring me on to one of my favourite subjects as with
Good.
all politicians, which is when's the next general election. I mean, if the general election's in May, I genuinely don't see that they've got time to do
Right.
that. Even if it's in November, I think we'd be hard pressed to see how they can do that in that time frame.
Yes.
So I don't see that being the problem. I think there will be others. And when we go back to 2010, 2011, when Jeremy Hunt imposed a 19% cut, I mean, there's layer upon layer upon layer of cuts has happened over the last 14 years. Most of us watching the BBC still think the news and current affairs is good, but Newsnight's taken a hammering, which will kick in quite soon. And I'm a big fan of Newsnight, partly because I like going on it, but I like watching it as well. That's quite hard to take, but I can see how they feel that they've been pushed into a position that's not ideal. So, no, we're going to have a good dialogue, Tim and I. It's going to be interesting over the next few months, but I want to preserve the principle of universality, come what may, and the concept of public service broadcasting. It's such a great British institution.
Yes, I mean, this is a general problem for the Labour Party, where you had a succession of governments that have cut public services, not just BBC, but benefits and all the rest. And then a Labour government comes in under very difficult, positively constrained financial circumstances, and the most that it can do is maybe give a little bit back, but not very much.
Well,
and defeat all the aspirational politics and high hopes, and induce a further round of cynicism and apolitical apathy as a result. I mean, just to paint the bleakest picture.
And you paint a very bleak picture. And yet, in 1997, the incoming Labour government stuck to the Conservative spending plan and did transform the country over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. It was a very different country after 2 rounds of Labour government. I think that that's one of the reasons why you will not be able to get a hair between shadow cabinet members in conversations like this or in the media about we know what we can commit to, and everything that's outside that, we can't. And that's because we do know that cynicism is there, and we do not want to be part of continuing it. We know that the public
You
thinks
don't want to overpromise.
it's a bad idea at any time. And
You don't want to overpromise, but you also want to inspire.
yes, yes, of course. And I think one of the things I hope we're inspiring on is that we will not make promises that we don't know how we're going to pay for and deliver,
Right.
but also that we have high ambition for this country. So,
Yes.
I recognise and value and love the fact that our culture, our media and our sport are three of the best things that we do in this country.
Yes.
And I hope that what I'm doing when I'm meeting organisations in those three worlds is I hope what I'm doing is showing them that I will fight everywhere, anywhere, any source of money, of regulatory change, anything that I can do to give them the opportunity to do what they do best. I don't want to tell a museum how to run a museum. I want to make sure they've got the resources
Yes.
that they need. And that's what my job will be, is to not just about financial resources, but there are certain things that, say, the museum sector or the film sector or the art market, for that matter, or newspapers are asking me for,
Yes.
which are not to do with money.
No.
They're really not. And so certain things are about, for instance, trading arrangements.
Yes, talk about that, because I noticed that
Yeah.
in the research that I was doing on
Mm-hmm.
you and your policies. There was an interesting exchange in relation to an aspect of your arts policy, the production of a kind of arts map. And you were asked the question, how much is that going to cost? And you gave the answer, nothing, which was a really interesting exchange because
Nothing
it
costs nothing, really, does
well,
it?
no, but I didn't, that wasn't
You're
my
not buying
point
it,
in a way.
yeah.
I didn't mind that. I thought, of course, actually a creative, imaginative politician can actually have ideas that don't have price tags. It's actually possible to be innovative without presenting a bill.
Yes.
And this seemed an interesting example of it. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So most local authorities already do really, really good work mapping what they already have in terms of cultural and artistic provision, and including the creative industries. Like, so where are the film studios or the games makers? Most local authorities already do lots of that. What they don't do, and what I would like civil servants in DCMS to do, they already know this, so I'm not breaking any confidences, is join up those maps and join them up as well with maps of the transport system of this country. That allows you to spot much more clearly where there are gaps. And I already know I don't need to spend any money to tell you that there is no cinema in Sunderland, there is no cinema in Wigan.
Right.
Right? So that's a really basic part of most people's cultural life. And I don't need to spend any money to tell you that, actually travelling to a cinema in another city from either of those places, it may look like not very far on the map, but if you know anything about the railways at
Yes.
the moment, you'll know that that's
Yes.
not easy. And if you know anything about the buses, you know it's not easy. So it's a matter of allocating civil servants to your priorities, the civil servants who will currently be working on some other aspects of government policy. And of course, I've got my own ideas about what I would like them to do less of.
Yes.
And what I want them to do more of.
Yes.
But actually, my main thing with the cultural mapping is I want to have a really good, strong partnership with local authorities and mayors. And they are, almost all of them, already doing a lot of that. What they aren't able to do, and I would be able to do as Secretary of State, is bring that together and look at culture in a much more, in a national way,
Yes.
but also with a regional lens, because I want everybody everywhere to have access to the best possible arts and culture, and to the potential jobs that you can get in the creative industries, and
Yes.
to the joy. So jobs and
Yes.
joy are my two favourite words in this brief. But that doesn't mean that you put the same things absolutely everywhere.
No.
But it means that you have what Chris Bryant, who's my one of my team, shadow ministers, working with me on the creative industries, we think of it as the sort of the Chris Bryant, Thangam Debbonaire, the Rhondda Valley versus the centre of Bristol. There should be no reason why, there's no biological inherent reason why young people in Chris's constituency are any less talented, any less capable, being a games maker or a musician or a DJ than mine. But mine in Bristol Central have more opportunities just physically around them. And then even within my constituency, there is a social and demographic gap between a group of young people in the very poorest part of my constituency,
Yes.
one of the poorest parts of the country, who are physically closer to the cultural spots, but for all sorts of other reasons, social, class, other forms of inequality, discrimination in some cases, much less connected to them than those at the richer part of my constituency.
Right.
So, again, with the party of equality.
Yes.
And I want to make sure that when we know what those barriers are, and we do with some of them and we don't with others, that we are showing how we're going to try and correct them, change them, transform them.
Yes.
But also, we're not saying, I'm going to sit in Whitehall and say, right, I know that Wigan doesn't need a cinema, it needs a dance studio.
Yes.
I'd much rather ask Wigan what Wigan thinks it's got.
Yes.
And when I went to visit Sunderland recently, and I went to an old mining village, it's no longer got a mine, but it's got mining heritage.
Yeah.
It's got history. It's got band history. And that's very different cultural history to the one of my city centre in Bristol or London. I think most communities have got a pretty good idea of the range of things that they want to enjoy. And I think the Arts Council is critical in this, but so are local authorities, who used to be, and still are actually, one of the major sources of funding for publicly available arts and culture.
Yes.
Arts funding under local authorities over the last 14 years has been difficult because they've had massive funding cuts.
Yes.
But a lot of them have managed to hang on to the best. Some of them have really struggled.
Yes. So encouraging cooperation, removing irrational barriers.
Yes. Planning.
Planning
Planning is
doesn't
amazing.
in itself cost any money, because there's already the investment in paying your salary and your civil servant salaries and all the rest
But
of
then
it.
you have to work out how you're going to fix the problems.
And
that
then-
that brings us on to the next bit,
Yes.
which is I am talking to and working with and researching any and every source of possible funding that there is. And people
Right.
often think about, and they use the word subsidy, which I frankly ban in my team. We don't need to talk about subsidy for publicly invested arts. They are invested in, and they are the R&D of the commercial sector. So you run a successful games company, one of our best exports, by the way. It's one of the things we do really, really well. But to get the workforce you need the school sector and the university and college sector to have invested in the skills. But you will also have musicians who have worked in the publicly invested sector, such as an orchestra, and their skills, which are then bought in by the games industry to make music, or the film. I mean, one of our great sources of income for musicians, for a small number of musicians, is film music.
Yes.
The film industry comes to this country for our musicians, not because they're the cheapest, but because they're brilliant at sight reading. And that's a real skill. Now, that took investment by the public sector. So I think of it as, you have the publicly invested sector, which does take public money, whether it be via the Arts Council, local authorities, or directly funded from DCMS. But you also have private equity that wants to invest in our creative industries.
Of course.
But needs to see some certainty in the line of travel from government.
Yes.
You have pension funds, you have dormant assets, you have the lottery, you have all sorts of things which, if properly harnessed and you take a good picture, like what's there at the moment that's not being used, what costs could we reduce? If you look at the art market, which I think is the event you were talking about, the art market says to me, we actually don't want you to give us any money, we'd just like you to tweak the trading arrangements. And that will make them more money.
Yes.
That's making them more money, and then they can pay more in taxes,
Yes.
which I can then
Yes, of
hopefully
course.
try and...
Yes. I mean, it's a
system.
it's also it runs in parallel with your interest in governance.
Yes.
In sports.
Yes.
It's how to fine tune the structural arrangements that allow the actual participants in the industries to fully realise their potential and be as successful as they can
So
be.
football isn't asking me for any money at the moment. I mean,
No.
bits of it are asking other bits of it for money, but
Yes.
what they're mostly asking me for is, where's the football governance bill?
Yes.
I mean, not every bit of the football industry is asking, where's the football governance bill? Some bits of it are saying, can it go away, please? But we are, I mean, I can tell you this shouldn't be news, but if the government doesn't bring in the football governance bill, we will. Because we know what value it's going to have and we know why it matters. but they're not asking me for money at the moment. But I think where they should be asking me for money more, and certainly Sport England are aware of this, is where have all the pitches gone? Where are the schools that have got absolutely nowhere to play? A lot of them were sold off 10 years ago. I'm not just talking about schools, I'm talking about local authorities as well.
Yes. I mean, it's shocking actually that we've spent the best part of an hour talking about your brief and we haven't discussed football yet, which is, as of course, as we all know, the national religion. And I suppose that must make you the Archbishop of football or the shadow Archbishop.
No, I
of
think that's
football.
Keir. I think that's
Is it-
genuinely
he's
true. I think he's the Archbishop.
He's probably the patron saint.
I think he is, but I mean, I have with sport. I came to sport quite late in life. I mean, I wouldn't even call what I do sport. I'd call it physical activity.
Right.
But quite late in life, I was a brown girl in the 70s, and football gave me a very clear message about how welcome brown girls were. Not very, and that kind of leaves its mark on you.
Yes.
But I've discovered how interesting football governance is and where the politics lie, and that football is a fun thing to do, to play for a lot of people, or to go to a match. And also that my job as a politician isn't, Keir does this really well. He can play football. The man's obsessed, and I think in a really good and healthy way. I have a different love of physical activity. I go running, and I do it a lot, but I'm not massively good at it. I'm never going to win a marathon. I have run in one, but I'm never going to win one.
Yes.
Remarkable for a very competitive person not to want to win one, but I'm happy with my time. But actually not that happy. I want to improve on it this year. But I know that where the politics lies is which people are being excluded, who is not getting to enjoy physical activity.
Right.
And it's often women and girls. Often women and girls in some forms of physical activity.
And that also doesn't take money. That takes a particular kind of focus and energy and effort and interest.
And doing what I did last night, which is there was someone sitting next to me at a dinner, a sports dinner actually, who's a sports clothing manufacturer, and I said, "What are you doing about women's bras?" Any of you run, you know what I'm talking about. Also, if you've ever been pregnant, you will know how unsuitable most women's sports clothing is. If you've ever been a teenager who is anxious about her period, you will know how much it matters that the clothing is right. I had breast cancer 8 years ago, 9 years ago, well, 15 anyway, 15 to 16. That's when I discovered physical activity, because my surgeon said you need to hop, because your bones are weakened because of the chemotherapy, so you need to prevent osteoporosis. And he said one of the best things you could do is impact. And he also said, and you need to keep your weight down, because that's how you prevent the recurrence of breast cancer. So I went out walking, and eventually one day I was impatient, just started running. And that's when I discovered that running is actually quite fun. It is for me, it's not for everybody. But I also discovered that sports clothing for women ain't great. No,
Really?
and yes, and that there are good manufacturers of it, and there are some really bad ones. And the expensive ones are not always great. And that seams can chafe in places that, the designer probably thought it looked great, but, actually when you put the damn shorts on, it's not very nice. And that's also to do with women's bodies. We are not the same shape as men. And this sports manufacturer I was speaking to last night, I won't name him because he was a good guy, but he said, yes, we've mostly just done what's called pink it and shrink it. Yeah, women in the room, you know what I'm talking about. And it's really annoying. But I mentioned breast cancer partly because it's what got me exercising, but also if you've got scars, which if you've had breast cancer, you do, it really matters where the seams are. And, lots of women have breast cancer, 1 in 8 of us. So why not think about how to design a sports bra for women that have had breast cancer? Or why not think about how to design a sports bra that all women could wear, but that includes women who've had breast cancer or who have breastfed? Why not put some money into that? We're half the population. We're also pretty good runners. It just seems smart to me. And I hope he was convinced. He promised he'd come back to me with some bras.
No, but I think you're sorry. I mean, that's.
But that's the politics. Sorry.
No, but it's not. It's not only. It's not politics. I mean, and I absolutely don't think that there's any pejorative colouring to the word politics. But actually, what you're talking about, in addition, is using your office to exercise what might be called or would have been called at an earlier time moral leadership.
Yes. And I think that's important.
It's very important.
It's important that as a politician you're looking at, well, who is getting the benefit of the thing that I'm responsible for and who is being excluded?
Yes.
So every culture, media and sport organisation I meet, I say, where are women? Where are people of colour? Where are people from working class communities? And I mean horizontally and vertically. So some organisations say, we've got lots of black people. Yeah, they're on the football pitch, they're not in the board, right? And that, why does that matter? It matters for all sorts of good reasons. You make better decisions if you have a diversity of thought, of background, of experience. You make better stuff if you're a commercial company and you're challenged by people who
Yes,
aren't
and
all the
also,
same.
I mean,
You
any
just do.
party that's committed to equality, at the
And
very
it's who we are.
least, you should be committed to equality of access.
I was horrified to discover that it really wasn't that long ago and in my lifetime that women were allowed to compete in the marathon at the Olympics.
Right.
You know, I tell the story to when young women who'd say to me, you know, why did you become a feminist? And I say, because when my mom became a single parent and she went to the bank and said, I need to take over the mortgage, they sort of looked at her with a look of horror. And when she wanted to buy a washing machine when she was still married on hire purchase, they said, can you go back and get your husband to sign this piece of paper? Now, it's in our lifetimes. There are still things like that. The fact that it's in my recent lifetime that women were allowed to compete in the same sports as men's just appalls me, even though I don't want to do it myself.
It is shocking.
Why are we excluded?
It is
So
shocking.
how long have we been talking? I've
We've
lost all
been
sense of
actually,
time.
I know, and I'm slightly anxious that I've been delinquent.
Have you been delinquent?
I think
Are we supposed to have gone to Q&A already?
I think we're supposed to have gone to Q&A.
So, Shadow Secretary of State, wonderful to meet you. This is a question from a member of the Conservative Party. So, if you watch the TV and you look at various sections of the media, you'll see that the sort of two main parties are always pitted against one another, or at least they are certainly most of the time. What would you say is the proportion of times that you agree on things? Like, what is that like compared to the proportion of times that you disagree on things?
Can I ask your name, please?
Stuart.
Stuart. Lovely to meet you, Stuart.
But because we're running out of time, I think what I'd like you to do, I'm sure, and I'd like you to give the answer, but there were two other questions.
Yes, should we take them all?
Then you can...
I'll bring them together in a neat little
Yes,
whole.
exactly, and then we must draw a line under the proceedings. And questions, not speeches.
I'm Jane. I'm with Anthony's. If you'll allow me, just going to make one observation. I'm a Sunderland lass. We don't have a cinema, but we may soon have a world-class film studio.
Yes, I know
Glad to
about
answer
that film studio.
That's good.
Oh, yeah.
Right. That's my question.
Yeah.
You talk about, I thought powerfully about creative education, and one thing I would love to see from a government of any colour is a strategy for creative education and through life, in midlife as well. I'd love to see that emerge one day from somebody.
Great.
Because I benefited from midlife creative education. I'd love to
Thank
see
you,
others.
Very good.
And a great stadium.
Yes. Yes.
And then our third question at the back, and then you can...
I'll
wind us
segue them
up.
all together.
Wind us up in a good sense.
Hi, I'm Fazana. I play in the largest grassroots inclusive women's football team in London. Similar to, I suppose, the constituency is similar to Easton rather than Clifton. And I have a question because I've noticed that Anthony mentioned charging for football, and we've seen off the back of the Euro 2020 and the Women's World Cup that there's a huge demand now for women's football matches, particularly record-breaking attendance at here in my favourite team, Arsenal. And I was just wondering what the strategy is for women's football in terms of making it accessible and commercially viable for growth in terms of broadcasting rights.
Yeah.
But also off the back of what we saw was great commercial interest during the Euros 2020 of Pitch Please with a P, to sort of make football accessible for younger generations of women. What's the strategy long term, which doesn't exclude people on the basis of, paying for fees or so on?
Okay, I'm going
Three
to try and answer them
in-
all
in
together.
2 minutes.
I can't give you an absolute proportion, but we get along. We're colleagues. We agree on lots of things. You'll see if you watch select committees that it's often very difficult to tell who's the Conservative, who's the Scott Nat, who's the Lib Dem and who's the Labour. You know, we're focused on scrutinising the government. There are Conservative chairs of select committees and members of select committees who are very tough on their own side and vice versa. I actually think that in our committee work, which is under noticed, if you watch politics at all, most people just watch PMQs, which is the most unrepresentative bit of the week. I've got to tell you that stuff is very, very unrepresentative of how we work. But we have different ideologies. But I'm on shows with Conservative colleagues who we can chat, we go on, we can debate fiercely and then go off again. I'm perfectly capable of holding a different political opinion from someone and getting along, and also finding the thing that we have in common, which is, you know, it will be often about those things that there is no obvious party political message on.
Yeah.
In terms of creative education, yeah, Jane, I share your ambition. My ambition is that everybody everywhere, and I meant everyone, not just young people, is able to pick up and learn something new, enjoy something new, be exposed to different things, or the thing that they've always loved. And why I mentioned Sunderland and cinema. But, you know, yes, I know about the film plans, the studio plans. I think they're great, and I'm really interested in seeing how I can help. And in terms of women's football, which team, by the way? Okay. Okay, well, I hope that at some point you invite me to come and watch. I can tell you right now, getting women's physical activity from women's sport. So women's sport is within women's physical activity. It's going to be a big priority for me. It already is. You've heard me bang on about bras already. So, you know, it's not for nothing. That's not just a minor pursuit. It's a big deal. To make it commercially viable, if we're talking about women's football, you will know that there's all sorts of interesting options there. What I do know is that women's football at the moment is at a critical point. If it doesn't get the broadcasting rights it needs, it just won't be able to compete and grow. So I'm doing all sorts of things that I'm learning a lot about how I might be able to help that, shall we say. But it does need to get the broadcasting rights it clearly deserves, but also it needs to have backers and the public as well, but also politicians who believe in its ability to grow. Women's football is a great growth industry if you want to look at it in purely commercial terms, because it's going from here to here. Men's football's already here. Where's the potential for growth? Yeah, just a bit more. Whereas women's football's got such a potential for growth. I mean, I personally think if anyone wants to invest in women's football, now's the time to do it, because there's clearly great participation. There's clearly great potential. In terms of participation, our commitment, Bridget Phillipson and Keir, who announced it about creative education, it's actually creative and sport. And it's because we know that it's both creativity and sport and that they go hand in hand. And there's no point promoting women's football if there's only a small chunk of the population of girls who ever gets to play football at school or as a young person. So I met yesterday with the Football Foundation, and I've asked some tough questions of them about how are you making sure that there are pitches in the right places and that girls are getting to use them, that they've got the right changing rooms and the right facilities, and that we're not, you know, as I said with the clothes, not just pinking and shrinking, but actually thinking what might be the different needs. It is pointless if women's amateur games, women's amateur teams are told, yeah, you can have a go on our pitch, but not till 10 o'clock at night. I don't know, why is that pointless? You know, it's those sorts of things that I think shouldn't need to be explained, but if they do need to be explained, I will be doing that. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to make sure that women and girls, as well as men and boys, have access to the widest possible physical activity, arts and culture, and that's going to be what I'm going to do if we win the election.
Well,
I hope that was neatly tied up.
it was brilliantly, succinctly and
Oh,
comprehensively formulated series of
you.
answers. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming and giving us
It's a great
some of your time. Thank you very much,
Thank
Thangam
you.
Debbonaire.